On today's episode of Time Traveller's Archive, we're going to be discussing the much debated question of whether the Benin Bronzes should be returned to Nigeria or kept in the British Museum. So this debate is going to consist of arguments both for and against the restitution of the bronzes. So let's just get straight into it. First, we're going to be hearing from guest speaker Manal, Kanata, Tor and Julian.
So I'd like to start off by what I deem as sort of being the most important aspect of restitution, which I think is the question of ethics. So the Benin Bronzes were forcibly acquired through violent colonial aggression and injustice during an expedition in 1897 as part of British forces' attempt to expand Britain's political and economic influence in West Africa. I believe that returning them means Britain would publicly acknowledge their wrongful acts, and it would be a positive step toward decolonising institutions more broadly, which we as university students think is incredibly important. And I think that it would alleviate sort of that huge contradiction with the government's attempt to decolonise the curriculum, but then equally keeping these historical objects that have been tainted by violent colonialism.
You do bring up some interesting points, especially surrounding ethics. However, we surely have to acknowledge that returning the Benin Bronzes would have a vast amount of consequences on Britain. It would perhaps mean that Britain would have to return other artefacts because it would be unfair to pick and choose which ones get returned to their home countries. This would be an issue as it would have set a precedent in which other nations begin to demand the return of their possessions. In reality, this would be very difficult. To begin with, it would not be up to the British Museum itself to return artefacts, as it's constrained by the British Museum Act of 1963, which ultimately means it's up to Parliament. This would mean that the law would have to change, which would be very time-consuming and less likely. It's also interesting to note that when discussions of restitution have been brought up in the past, it has not been the most straightforward. So in 2023, Rishi Sunak had a meeting scheduled with the Greek president regarding the returns of the Elgin marbles. This didn't end up happening, and since then, another meeting has not been rescheduled. So I think it just goes to show that, whilst in a perfect scenario it would be favourable to return the bronzes, we need to consider the intricate legal and diplomatic negotiations that would have to go in the background to this.
I definitely agree that considering sort of that legal and logistical aspect is incredibly important in regards to restitution. But I think that, there's been other notable museums in London. So, for example, the London Horniman Museum, which announced in August of 2022 that it would hand over ownership of 72 bronzes to Nigeria. And equally, even on a global aspect, we've seen other sort of renowned museums. So, for example, the National Museum of Australia and even the German government has accepted that it's morally wrong. And they have also sort of taken a step towards restitution.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about other museums, for example the Horniman, it's obviously a much smaller museum, and I think that does have an important role in the arguments around restitution, because obviously the British Museum is an extremely large and important cultural institution with over 6 million visitors a year, offering educational programmes, workshops and guided tours, which we actually saw firsthand when we went to visit the Benin Bronzes, and there were school children who were taking part in the hands-on activities which are offered by the museum. And so I think we have to contrast this with the situation that would occur if the Benin Bronzes were to be returned to the Museum of West African Art, which would be in Benin City, and would therefore be less accessible to international visitors and would probably have a reduced educational impact. Equally, if they were returned to the OBA, then their public availability is no longer guaranteed, whereas in the UK, the British Museum is a publicly accountable body and their vested interest is in maintaining public availability of the artefacts held there. And alongside that, the British Museum has global outreach, and it's an academic hub of scholarly work. And I think that the removal of the Benin Bronzes would probably have a detrimental impact on the global academic research community. And I also think that the vast collection of the British Museum allows the Benin Bronzes to be better situated within their historical context. And so I think that it's important to consider all of these things rather than just necessarily the other arguments we've had.
I do agree on the point that with the British Museum, it has an unrivaled public outreach by storing the Benin Bronzes there, and it can also enhance education. But for me, I think it's about how the Benin Bronzes will inevitably have much more cultural meaning in its original society. It can aid in preserving cultural sovereignty and identity. I think that essentially the value of the Benin Bronzes to their original culture, their Nigerian culture, can be judged as far outweighing any value it has to a British collection, and consequently British museums and the British Museum are hindering people from accessing their cultural history. The return of the bronzes could generate a sense of pride and more inspiration, and we can't necessarily assume that it will go back into a private collection for the Oba. I'm sure that because they are such an impressive display of artisanship, of Nigerian artisanship, they will want to display it. We have a section on our website that focuses on the impressive artisanship of the Benin Bronzes, but we found that by being in the British Museum, it was the bronzes were more dominated by a narrative of colonial conquest, and I certainly think that being in Benin, it's much more likely that the art of it and the legacy of the Benin Bronzes and bronze casting will be much better understood and appreciated in its original culture, and will sort of, in a way, be removed from that narrative now that it's back in its original context.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I feel like living in a day and age where we've got sort of like vast technology at our disposal, I think that there could even be a possible situation where we feel a presence both in Britain and in Nigeria, perhaps through sort of having like a clone of the bronzes in Britain and then having the real objects in Nigeria. So I definitely feel like there are sort of alternative solutions that the British government could be sort of focusing on.
Although it is true that many West Africans are in favour of repatriation and in seeing the bronzes back in West African museums, it's important to remember that this isn't a unanimously held view. For example, the Senegalese historian Hamadi Bokoum instead believes that African museums should prioritise emphasising and displaying aspects of African history which haven't yet been tainted by colonialism, which haven't been looted and stolen and then a century or so later returned to Africa, and that instead really focusing on these original African pieces of work will help to, in his words, define themselves outside the prison of Western borders. Additionally, Deidre Farmer-Paleman, who leads the restitution study group, argued that the bronzes should be kept in Western Museum because it gives access to the descendants of slaves. She argues that many of the bronzes were made after the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, and that many of the resources used to create the bronzes were actually paid for using money that the Edo people got from selling slaves and weapons. She also argues that museums like the Horniman Museum are doing a disservice to the descendants of slaves, and that similarly to the argument of global outreach, the British Museum is simply much more available to the now living descendants of slavery in the UK or in America and such. And she also argues that Nigeria should not only apologise for slavery, but shouldn't be allowed to enrich itself via the return of the Benin Bronzes, which would, of course, bring in many more tourists and money to Nigeria.
Yeah, I think alongside these considerations around heritage, we also have to consider the security of the objects themselves. So I think it's probably fair to say that they would be more secure being held in the British Museum, given recent reports from academic bodies such as the African Centre for Strategic Studies, which have described Nigeria's security outlook as precarious. There's a heightened threat of terrorist activities and theft, both in terms of the transport and the storage and display of the bronzes within Nigeria, and terrorist groups and religious extremists such as Boko Haram have been known to target controversial and culturally important works of art and other historical artefacts. And so I think that we need to consider the physical security of the objects, as well as also their legal protections, which would be, we know, more secure within the UK and the British Museum thanks to the Museums Act.
I do think that safety is a big concern, but we shouldn't obviously just assume that because the Benin Bronzes are in Western countries that they are automatically safe. So in World War II, there's been examples of the Benin Bronzes being victim to bombs in, I think, the Liverpool Museum. So once again, this just reiterates my point that we shouldn't assume based on location that the bronzes are automatically safer in a particular space.
Yeah, and if Western museums are truly concerned about the safety of the objects, they can in fact collaborate with museums in Nigeria to foster a safer space for the bronzes there, which is what France and Germany have done and are doing. So the French Development Agency planned to lend 20 million euros to help fund the construction of a new museum in Benin. And Germany is also helping Nigeria set up a new museum in Benin City for the bronzes. So Britain can easily follow their examples. It's not something new. and it will also enable more collaborative dialogue and relationship between the two countries.
Yeah, so we've had really significant and interesting arguments for and against restitution of the Benin Bronzes, but we're really interested to hear what you guys think as our audience, so please leave your thoughts and opinions in our interactive poll.
Listening to this week's episode of Time Traveller's Archive, be sure to tune in for next week's episode.